Warsaw 1920. A war had just ended and a new one started when the Russians decided to invade Poland, and the game depicts precisely the situation in which you will see that the Polish forces were not ready to respond to that. On the other hand, the Russian forces had all sorts of supply problems, so you have a really interesting puzzle here as both sides are facing interesting challenges when it comes to logistics especially. It is a game for two players. One player controls Polish forces, the other player Russian forces, but you can also play solitaire two-handed, and that is how I played it. The game has a single paper map, one mapper representing, well, the area where the Russian forces are coming from, and what you see here is the situation of setup. I set up the game for you. Don't say I never do anything for you. Also, it's set up, so probably I'll play it later. And then, so we're gonna have the forces of the Russians coming here. There's some defenders here, some more scattered defenders up there. We have a swamp that is also full of rivers right in the middle of the map. And that will divide the action effectively in two fronts. And actually also the Russian forces are indeed divided into two separate forces that need to be supplied independently, the West Front and the Southwestern Front. The swamp, so, is not the best place, but there is a railroad that goes through it. So although it can be, well, you can get stuck there, there may be also ways of moving in there. And here we have Warsaw, the main objective that the Polish player has to defend at all costs, and that the Russian player is trying to take control of at all costs. Because if the Russian player ever takes control of Warsaw, the game is over immediately, instant death, instant Russian victory. Otherwise, the game will continue for 8 turns, and then you count victory points that are based on control of cities, major cities, and regular cities on the board. These orange and yellow cities here, they're worth victory points to the player who controls them at the end of the game. You also score points for eliminating elite enemy units, for isolating enemy units, and forcing them that way to surrender. Then, as we said, the Polish forces are not ready to respond at the beginning of the game. The first couple of turns, their agency is severely limited. Matter of fact, they get less than 3 operational phases. We'll see what that means later. They get 1 at the beginning, 2 next, and then they unlock their 3rd operation phase either in turn 5 or in turn 6. And that represents when they're starting the full counterattack. If the Polish player decides to start a counterattack, that is to get the 3 operation phases per turn, on turn 5, then they give 4 victory points to the opponent, or better, they lose 4 victory points. If the Polish player gets 3 operation phases from turn 6, then they don't lose any victory points. This is a secret decision that the Polish player performs during the game, and I play the game solo. The way I do it, I randomize them, and then I draw one, and that's a little bit or a lot of uncertainty. So we're talking about operation phases. The easiest way for me to show you that is to show you the section of the rulebook. This is very important. I wish that the turn structure was also on the player aid, which has a combat table, game effects, terrain effects, but again, this is only in the rulebook. So you're gonna have a Polish player turn followed by a player turn in each of the 8 game turns, but on turn 1 the Polish player stays idle and only the Russian player acts. In any case, the general idea is that a player's turn starts with a reinforcement and reorganization phase. Then each player has up to 3 operations, and then they both get a refit phase. But again, here's the idea that first turn, the Polish player does nothing. Second turn, they get 1 operation phase. From turn 3 on, they get 2. And again, they get to unlock their 3rd operation phase in turn 5 or 6, depending on whether they want to lose 4 points or not. The Russian player always gets 3 operation phases. So you think, well, they are going to be able to do a lot at the beginning. They're going to be able to do something. Because They don't have a lot of supplies. Their problem is supplies. As I said, the forces are divided into Southwest Front and Western Front, and each has a track indicating how many supplies that front has. So yes, the Russian player always has 3 operations per turn. But each time you take an operation, you have to decide if you want to supply a front or not. So for example, in say turn 1, the first operation phase, I decide that I'm not supplying the Southwestern Front, but I am supplying the Western Front. They'll be able to act at full capacity, full ability, and then I spend an operation point. I perform that operation phase, I will see what that means. Later decide that I want to supply both, and then I spend a point for both. And then I decide to be a little more parsimonious, and I decide to take my last operation phase, leaving both fronts unsupplied, and then I don't have to spend those. You get 1 refueling, basically 1 pit stop per game as the Russian player. Once per game you can decide to regain supply points, because they'll go down, they will go down. And when you regain them, you will give victory points when you to the Polish player when you're resupplying. You're also spending operation phases. You're also going to lose some operation phases depending on how much fuel you want to get back in there. The more you get, the more supply points you get back, the more operation phases you lose, just for the logistical headaches that requires. So that's a very interesting idea, and I can really tell you, general idea is that each time you activate again the Russian forces, if they're out of supply and they're moving, then the movement values are reduced in half, rounded up. If they're attacking, then the combat value is halved, rounded up. And as you probably have figured out, these numbers here are bottom left, the combat value, bottom right, movement value. Was that guy there? I don't know, but he's there now. So we have been talking about those operation phases, that the Russian player always gets 3 of them, but they have to decide if they're gonna supply their fronts or not. And the Polish player gets first 1, then 2, then at some point, mercifully, finally 3. Those operation phases, again, you get up to 3 per turn. The Russian player always 3. And here's the interesting idea. During an operation phase, you choose if you want to have a combat operation phase or a movement operation phase, which is what it sounds. During a movement operation phase, all your forces can move, not attack. During a combat, all your forces can attack, not move. And there is no limit. You have 3 per turn. You can spend all 3 fighting or all 3 moving, although that's rarely a good idea. And let's say that turn 1, again, the Polish player is not doing anything at the beginning. Remember, I decide that the front here is not quite where I want them to be. And so I decide that the Western Front is going to move, but they don't need to go a long distance. So they're going to do movement at half speed. And the Southern Front, some of them are ready to fight. So I decided I want them to fight, and I want them to fight supplied. And so that's how it works. So in each operation phase, again, you decide if you wanna move or attack, not both. Remember, the Western Front was gonna move, and movement is what you have in so many war games, which is units will move up to their allowed movement allowance. In this case, remember, we are halving them, but see, they're not going far. When you enter an enemy zone of control, you have to stop immediately. All combat units project a zone of control in the 6 hexes surrounding them. You cannot move from a zone of control to another zone of control directly. That makes the classic other hex, alternating hex defense very important for the Polish player. But again, with 2, I could be able to do this, 1, 2, but I can't because there is a river there, so I just cannot go from there to there. But I could do that, I think. So, that would be it. Again, that was the operation phase for that front, and for this front we said we're gonna do combat, and so we're gonna do combat. We declare combat, and the way it is you add all the combat values of the attackers. Combat is from, okay, let's suppose that these guys are here. Combat is from a number of adjacent hexes into a specific hex. It attacks all of the defenders, and it's classic combat odds. You take all of the attack factors of the attackers, divide them by all of the attack factors of the defenders, and the combat factors of defenders are massively improved by terrain. If you catch them in the open, as a Russian player, you're gonna defeat them easily. But when they're in these cities, you need to take your time to mount some mighty attacks, because even just a couple of otherwise unimpressive defenders become really tough when their strength is tripled. So, combat factor of the attacker divided by the defender, turn it into a ratio. Find the corresponding column, roll a die, possibly apply a modifier such as Russian artillery gives you a +1 to the die roll, apply the result. The result is what you see here. There aren't a lot of results that eliminate units right away. It is one of those games where the biggest killer is forcing an opponent to retreat and cut off their path of retreat. Because a unit cannot retreat into space with an enemy unit, a unit cannot retreat into a zone of control. So you surround them and then you force them to retreat. Now, interestingly enough, suppose that they can retreat and they're not killed in the process. Suppose that these units are forced to retreat 2 spaces, for example. We retreat them, and after they retreat, they're flipped to their side. All combat units in this game, which is unusual, are single-sided, and they also disrupted on the other side. A disrupted, and then you have advance after combat, super important for the Soviet player. Also, entering cities allows a player to, the Russian player, take control of Polish cities, allows them to steal some supplies, and that's very important. Disrupted units, for the time being, they just sit there. If an enemy unit moves next to them, they have to rout, that is, move away, and then they will return to their normal status at the end of the friendly player's turn. So Polish, at the end of their turn, the disrupted will flip that way. That means that now, the next time the Polish player goes, these units are just sitting there disrupted and doing absolutely nothing. So you can wait until the end of your turn, and they'll be reorganized automatically, or any and all of your disrupted units can be taken off the mat for refit or reorganization, and they're placed 2 turns ahead, and they will enter as reinforcements. And that's really the general idea. So, as you can see, maybe you're thinking, wait, that was a lot of words for saying move, stop in an enemy zone of control, declare attacks, and use combat odds table. These are, at its core, this is a very simple, very basic, very classic intro war game with a lot of other things going on when it comes to all the logistics that have to be taken into account around that core of incredibly simple ideas. But in essence, this is how you play Warsaw 1920. So, Warsaw 1920, the components are pretty good, the counters are nice and thick. If I can find the camera, I can show them to you. No problem there with the counters. The map is readable. It's simple, but that's what I like in wargaming maps. It looks thematic enough, but yet at the same time, it's still very readable, still very functional. One thing that could be done better is the rulebook. There are just some areas of the rulebook that are not particularly well organized. So you have a section that talks about the combat and retreat, and that's the retreat. And then in another section it says combat units get disrupted at the end of that retreat. Now that really should be in the retreat section, not at the beginning of the following section. Things like that, things that are underexplained, that are not where they should be. There isn't an index, so you're flipping through the pages at the beginning when you're learning the game. And yes, there are some procedures that will feel fiddly at the beginning of the game. Wait, how does that work again? How many phases there are here that we need to use. One thing I didn't mention, the Polish player, even after they get 3 operation phases per turn, they have full combat, their full movement only during the first operation phase. The other two, their movement is halved if they decide to move more than once, but their combat is never reduced. They're just these little things that if the rule book was more streamlined, I believe it would be easier for you to get into those. So there's a little bit of a bump at the beginning, not a steep curve, but a bump. But then the game really makes sense, and all of those things that feel fiddly then become much welcome and very engaging Chrome, and you get this really feel for the troubles, for the challenges that the two sides were facing. And that's one of the reasons why I play historical war games, because they allow me to see history from the point of view of the people that had to solve problems. And here you have an interesting puzzle for both sides, because especially for the Soviets, it's about pushing enough, pushing too much, pushing too early. If we fully supply, but they so doing, we take control of that city, then we can get a supply point. There are interesting decisions there, and I find in general the Soviet side to be a lot more fun to play, which is why the game may work better as a solitaire, two-handed solitaire. I do not know that I would enjoy playing the Polish side quite as much, because at the beginning you're not doing much. That's just it. You're just taking punishment, and the first turn you do nothing, the second turn you get 1 operation, and what are you gonna do? Probably not fight. Probably you're gonna move back just behind the next trench, behind the next river. You're gonna try to move away just enough that they need to spend 1 or 2 movement phases to get there, or you're forced to supply. So as the Polish player, but in general throughout the game, as the Polish player, your job is to defend. It's not a bulge game. It's not like one side slams the other at the beginning and gets punched in the face real hard, but then they get back and they get a big counterattack. That never happens. All you can do as a Polish player is to retreat judiciously, to slow them down as much as possible, to protect Warsaw at all costs. And yeah, from time to time you launch an attack, but it's usually not a great idea, because if I'm sitting in a city that gives me, triples my defense, but attacking out, then my defenses are just what the printed value, I'll probably just sit there and maybe put some people around there to prevent the opponent from surrounding the city. But you're not going to counterattack much. I would say the Polish counterattacks are merely notional. You're threatening their supply lines, for example. So it's still an interesting puzzle, because you don't want to get surrounded. You have to choose how much space you're trading, how much time and how much space you're juggling there. But the Soviet side, to me, just has a more interesting set of things to elaborate, to work with, because they have to handle the supplies, they have to decide, they always have 3 operation phases, so they have more things to decide. I could move now, attack, and then move again to exploit the possible retreats. But if I move and then attack, I will have more people surrounding the enemy. So that kind of problem surfaces all the time, and again makes playing the Soviet side particularly interesting. And so you have that, you have the supplies, the operation phases, and then you have those incredibly powerful defenders in cities, and so you really have a flow which is not linear, because you have these peaks of activity as you're mounting the powerful attack, forcing them to retreat, finally clearing a city, then you're running towards the next one, clearing that one, and maybe you decide to bypass one because again you're threatening Warsaw, and maybe you're not even gonna get there, but by doing so some defenders will move away from other things. So there are a lot of interesting interactions here between the various parts of the board, but again, it is definitely a game that I believe that has interesting puzzles for both sides, but the two sides are not the same, and the Russian one is just a little more interesting. But again, you have an incredibly simple idea. The core idea is not a lot more complicated than Strike Force 1, the iconic introductory war game. Move and attack, move is also controls, attack, combat odds. But the logistics surrounding it and the way the map is organized, we get these two fronts and the possibility of maybe sneaking through the swamp, these elements elevate such a simple idea to a whole other level, and they make for a really fun, really interesting game that if it was, the rulebook was better, I would recommend it as an introductory war game. I'm still going to recommend it as an introductory war game for people that want to put a little more effort. If this is your first war game, you got to put a little bit of faith in the process. But the game is good. It's a one-mapper that you can set up quickly by wargaming standards, that you can play in an evening easily, possibly twice in an evening if your evening is a little long. Very manageable and very playable with, again, an interesting flow, a lot of interesting decisions, and these are in general the things I like the most in a war game. So definitely high praise from me for Warsaw 1920.